This is going to be a blood work breakdown PowerPoint that I'm going to go through, and hopefully this gives you an idea of what it's like when I'm going through blood work with patients in the office. So I thought I'd go over the CBC metabolic panel and then maybe a little bit on cholesterol. For starters, there's two types of blood cells that are on the CBC. There are white blood cells and there are red blood cells. The white blood cells' primary role are with the immune system. When you look at the white blood cell count, you're looking at the total size of the army that makes up the immune system. When you're looking at the total number of red blood cells, you're looking at the number of vehicles that are able to deliver oxygen to every cell in the body. Talking about the white blood cells first. If they're elevated, that means that total size of the army is elevated. It means that there is an acute infection likely. If they've been thinned out, that's more likely to be a chronic issue. The next part of the white blood cell count is actually the differential. So how many different types of soldiers are part of that immune army? There are primarily neutrophils, lymphocytes, basophils, eosinophils, and monocytes. We'll look at monocytes and lymphocytes. They tend to be inversely related, meaning when the bacterial numbers are going up, the viral numbers will be depressed, and vice versa. So one way to remember that is lymphocytes kind of make an L, turn it on the side. That makes a V. Elevated amounts of lymphocytes indicate some sort of viral infection. Dependent on the elevation or depression of the total white blood cell count, will tell you whether you have a chronic bacterial or a chronic viral issue. With eosinophils, those immune cells are related to allergies. They will elevate in response to an allergic reaction, whether that's seasonal or otherwise. Also part of the differential are the monocytes. We'll consider that to be an inflammatory marker. You could have a perfect diet but still have inflammation floating around your body, and that's because of your immune system. It's not specific to anything in particular, not specific to infections or other indicators. It's just noted to be an inflammatory marker. As a side note, you should always consider leaky gut with elevated amounts of protein in the blood. We'll look at that later. On to the red blood cells. So the first three markers we'll look at are the hemoglobin, hematocrit, and the red blood cell count. Those three tend to run together. If they're elevating, that's usually a response to dehydration. You know, if you have a fish tank full of fish, you take the water out of it, you take a sample, you're going to get a lot more fish. It's going to look elevated, but there's just less water available, less fluid, most commonly. Alternatively, if you have a depression of those three numbers, they typically run together, but you'll see them in isolation as well. It's some type of anemia. Now, distinguishing between the types of anemia, these are just two very basic nutrient deficiency anemias. Most commonly, you'll see if the size and the shape of the cell is increasing, that is a megaloblastic anemia, which is B9, which is folic acid, or B12, methylcobalamin deficiency. There are many reasons for those two issues, which we won't go into detail here, but in general, it's some type of B vitamin deficiency. Depression or microcytic anemia would be an iron deficiency. You would see the three markers above decreasing. Onto the metabolic panel. This is a measure of your metabolism and how well you process protein, carbs, and fats. a elevation of protein or depression of protein could be an indication of low stomach acid. Elevation of proteins plus a monocyte elevation could mean that there's some destruction in the gut lining, leading to an increased amount of protein in the blood. It becomes important later on to see how well you're tolerating and handling those proteins, which we won't get to in this video, but maybe in a later video, or we'll make a part 2. Next, we'll talk about fats, or the triglycerides as it would be labeled on the report. If there's a decreased number of triglycerides, generally the most obvious answer to that is to eat more fat. It's very common. You see this with people with blood sugar handling issues. On a medical lab report, 0 is the bottom line, so you'll never see this flag. However, when you're looking at the functional report, 85 and above is the ideal range there. A elevation of triglycerides, however, is an indication of a decrease in metabolism. That can be due to insulin resistance. Most commonly, you'll want to see that paired off with the glucose, which will be next, also elevated. Commonly, you'll see a functionally depressed or hypothyroid patient with elevated triglycerides as well. Here are the carbs, or the glucose, as you'll see on the report. Low, below 85, is dysglycemia or reactive hypoglycemia, especially patients that have anxiety, chronic inflammation. You're going to see this show up a lot. Waking up between 1 and 3 is very common. Elevation in glucose, that is very, everyone's really good about pointing that one out. It's insulin resistance, diabetes. Primary intervention for a metabolic panel that is disrupted is dietary. However, with the hypothyroid problems, you'll have to do further blood work to figure that out. There are 24 different thyroid patterns, hypo and hyper, if insulin resistance is not the indication. Talking about cholesterol specifically, it's not a fat problem typically. Most common when I see in the office when we're correcting those issues, it's not because somebody's eating too much fat. On the lab report, you're going to see not only the total cholesterol, but the bad cholesterol, the oxidized LDL, and a depressed HDL when you have either insulin resistance, some sort of inflammatory reason, which is almost just as common in the office as seeing insulin resistance. You'll see an increased amount of cholesterol and the LDL in hypothyroidism as well. HDL specifically, you don't really see that, but you do see that depressed when people have been sedentary for too long. That one's a pretty easy one to correct. Common sources of inflammation. This will be the last thing we go over, part of 1. Common sources, the first 2 places people are always going to look here are leaky gut or digestive issues, or immune-driven issues. Leaky gut issues or any digestive issue, usually dysbiosis that has led to chronic inflammation in the gut. It's one of those things, no matter how good your diet is, your body's going to be an inflammation factory. So you need to correct that imbalance. Usually doesn't involve probiotics, usually involves reducing the overgrowth and then solidifying that, letting the gut heal. Alternatively, something that can be later on down the road after leaky gut develops are immune-driven issues in very short autoinflammatory diseases. are vast, and many of us actually probably fit on that spectrum, but until they have specific diagnoses or tests, you will not have a specific disease diagnosis, such as MS or any of the autoimmune diseases, actually. I think that is where we're going to end it. Let me know if you have any questions. Go ahead and send me an email if you want to go through some blood work of your own. Just send me an email. We'll get it worked out.